Hello, so I'm Nicola Blunden. I'm a therapist, counsellor based in South Wales, teaching Bristol, and I'm here to facilitate a conversation between Myira Khan and Mick Cooper about your experiences in the counselling world. And we're focusing particularly on the experience of being a Muslim person, a Jewish person, and thinking about your kind of lived experience of that. And I'm hoping to provide some kind of facilitation, so there's someone asking questions, someone being curious. I'm a white woman, working class woman, kind of aware that I come in as a white person into the discussion, just wanting to make space for both of you. Welcome to listeners in this conversation, and perhaps I'll just hand over to you, Myira and Mick, to talk about, introduce yourselves for a minute or so, and then we'll go into the conversation. Myira.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. Yeah, so I'm Myira Khan. I'm an accredited counsellor, supervisor, and I also deliver training and workshops specifically or specialising in anti-oppressive practice. I think in terms of an introduction, that's kind of me professionally, but I think what also comes with that professionally is also visibly aspects of my identity as well. So I'm visibly a Muslim woman. I wear the hijab. I have founded and I'm the CEO of the MCAPN, the Muslim Counselling and Psychotherapist Network. But I'm very much here today in the position as an individual practitioner. What I'm going to be sharing today or thinking about together in dialogue with yourself, Nicola and Mick, is very much kind of my individual experience. So nothing I say here is representative of the network or of members generally.
Thank you, Myira. Thanks.
Yeah, so my name's Mick Cooper. I'm a professor of counselling and psychology at the University of Roehampton in London and a practicing psychologist and psychotherapy researcher. I guess for me, I came to this dialogue, I thought about it a long time. I identify as Jewish. I'm not religious. But I identify very much as Jewish and culturally Jewish, and maybe that's something we want to talk about. And seeing what was happening in Israel and Palestine and Palestinian territories, and being horrified by the violence and the destructiveness there, in both ways. Both the initial attack and then also the violence of the Israeli response. And I think for me, I spent a long time thinking about how is it possible to have a dialogue and talk about as from Jewish to Islamic, from Jewish to Muslim perspectives, to try and begin some dialogue just about the difference. Obviously it's not a complete dialogue, but just something that could open some communication in a way that I know does happen, but also I guess I felt like I wanted to see where I could take that. And Myira is something I know and have enormous respect for in a professional field, and felt like somebody I wanted to reach out to, see if she would be interested in having this dialogue, to explore some of these issues. And we talked about, particularly maybe in the counselling field, I'm not a kind of political expert in any way or kind of expert on world affairs, but I think speaking personally and to have a dialogue which was about us talking personally about what it meant to be being Jewish, what it meant to be being Muslim, what that meant to our mental well-being and our psychological functioning, to maybe enhance that understanding. Obviously, as Myra is saying, I'm not speaking for all Jews. I'm very much a secular, progressive Jew. I feel very, different from Netanyahu and much more right-wing perspectives. It feels very alien to me, but I do feel very Jewish.
Yeah, thank you. So I suppose, so that brings us to maybe the background to this conversation. So, and maybe what you would both want to come from this conversation. And why you're having this conversation, I guess. And I'm thinking about that in terms of maybe more widely, like what might this conversation be able to contribute or do or offer, but also maybe personally what you would like to come from the conversation, or something that is going to be helpful to you in some way, or interesting. Perhaps I'll ask you, Myra.
Yeah, great question. I think I want to kind of start by saying really that for me, I think this is about intention. And I think, you know, I can really resonate with what Mick says about, you know, wanting to have this dialogue, because I feel like as a Muslim practitioner, as a visible Muslim practitioner in the field, I suppose I'm looking at this from two perspectives. I think one is, so my intention's basically kind of a twofold. I think one is that we're actually being open about our experiences in the profession at a time where we are witnessing such trauma, destruction, violence, and it is a genocide. So I think for me, one of my two intentions is to be able to have that open conversation about, as practitioners, what is that experience and what is that impact, not only on us as individual practitioners, but also perhaps on our clinical practice, and what does it mean to be supporting clients that are also bringing this into our clinical rooms as well. And I think my second intention, and I think this very much, again, resonates with what Mick was saying, I think in having this dialogue, it's about being able to have that conversation across the faiths, rather than a conversation happening within each of our own faith communities, where actually I think this kind of interfaith dialogue from a place of openness and authenticity and vulnerability, I think is really needed as well, to be able to share what our experiences have been and our experiences continue to be, but in a way actually that feels kind of co-productive and collaborative.
Yeah, so partly in response to world events, but your personal response to that, the impact on you, the impact on your work and your clients, and doing that in a dialogical way, in a way that's kind of in relationship. And and I guess you getting out of that kind of an opportunity to reflect on your experience and have this dialogue across faiths or across identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to acknowledge, and I'm sure this will come up in our dialogue, that at a time where politics and the political field is so divisive, I think there's also something here about within the profession itself, the profession can start to feel divisive as well. And when there are calls for organisations or professional bodies that are either doing something or not doing something, when they get called out as being anti-Semitic or then Islamophobic, and it's like, that's whilst those things are kind of happening, I think it's really important again that we actually take time to actually think about what that's actually about, and not to get pulled into these kinds of polarity positions, but rather kind of, again, finding place for commonality and finding a position to go, actually, can we talk through what's actually happening in the field right now?
Yeah. Thank you, Myra. Yeah. Mick, what if I ask you the same thing, what your hopes are or your intentions are?
It's so interesting to hear what Myra is saying. I think for me, one of it is just to understand more about the Muslim experience and how it is to be a Muslim in the world and in the counselling world. I think I realise going into this that my understanding is pretty limited, and I'd like to understand more about that. And I think some of the nuances about that, and then how that, I guess how that then relates to the Jewish. There's things about being Jewish that I'd like to share and talk about, and try and be open and transparent about that, because I think sometimes that isn't totally understood. So I guess there's something about sharing, and again, some of the nuances of that and what it means to be Jewish, and then also to explore some of the projections and the counter projections, some of the assumptions or not assumptions, and then how that between Muslims, Jews, how that gets kind of mixed up, and maybe to untangle some of that. I think maybe that's a good way of putting it, actually, is to untangle some of that, as Myra was talking about, so that we can be clear about how we relate to each other and find ways of relating that are kind of more productive. I guess I believe very deeply that we're all fundamentally human, that culture is really important, but we are all fundamentally human with the same needs and the same wants to find ways of thriving and yeah, I think coming, I guess, from a humanistic place, I think people are basically intentions are good, but it can get very messed up, and what starts off as good can end up being incredibly destructive.
I was thinking as you were talking about that, about kind of the human meeting and disentangling kind of maybe the human, the kind of deeper existential meeting or human meeting, and then disentangling that from the stories, the cultural stories that are kind of we're bound up in and we bind each other up in. And it made me think about the place of faith in this as well, or a humanistic perspective or a faith perspective, and how that might be different and similar to cultural identity as well. So that might be something that we come back to. But is there, before we kind of get into that experience, your individual experiences, is there something that you both, I mean, what would you need or want from me and from each other to have a good conversation? What would be helpful to be able to get into that disentangling?
I think for me, the biggest aspect of this, I think, is that openness. And I always go back to that principle of two truths. You know, when you're in conversation with somebody, it's the ability to sit with kind of being able to hold your own truth while simultaneously being able to hold somebody else's truth. And I think, and I already know that we're going to do that, because obviously I've kind of, you know, having worked with both of you before and knowing both of you, that's something that I think you both always offer anyway. And I think that's something that I think that's kind of even more needed, because I think actually, I suppose that's exactly what we're talking about today, is what are our truths? And how can we then think about our truths and hold them all equally, respectfully, and equally of value?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's so well put, Myra. And yeah, I think something about that openness, that transparency, and I think, Nicola, your support for that, and questions and inquiry, but also kind of the holding and the care, that you know, we're opening up quite vulnerable areas, and I want to speak from a place of vulnerability, but that's also scary.
Yeah, and of course we're aware the whole time that this isn't just a private conversation. So there's always like the feeling actually of how of the listener, right, and how the listener might receive this. So maybe there's something about asking the listener to hold that openness about truth as well. That you're speaking to your truth from a kind of a vulnerable place, and to hold that in some care as well as the listener is listening would be probably really helpful. Okay, so perhaps should we start then by talking about, so Mick, you said one of the big things you were curious about was Myra's experience as a Muslim woman. And I wonder if that would be a way in to the conversation, if you're happy with that, Myra. So
Yeah.
What's your experience of being a Muslim woman in the counselling community at this time, you know, in this kind of process that's happening?
Yeah. I think the word that keeps kind of going around in my head is this word representation. And the reason that word is kind of like floating around my head, I think it's for a number of reasons, because I think when you represent, or when I represent, or when anybody represents a particular marginalized or minoritized community, I think representation becomes quite a big, heavy, pressurized, burdensome word or concept. And so in thinking about my experience, the reason I think the word representation comes to mind is because my very first experience in entering the profession, which is now a scary thought, but it's like 14, almost 15 years ago when I started my training, I did not see or come across a single other Muslim practitioner. And And I suppose the reason I start there is because I think where I was and how I experienced that like 14, 15 years ago to how I now feel about that, it's such a big divide between the two. I feel like it's been such a journey. So, and I always start with that experience, because for me, that experience of being the only person of colour by the time I got to my final year on my training course, there was no person of colour who was on the tutor team. There was no person of colour who was in the placement that I was in for 3 years whilst I was training. There was no person of colour who was a qualified counsellor working in the placement either. So for me, being a Muslim practitioner, my experience was, oh, I'm the only one. And where are the other Muslim practitioners? And so all of a sudden, this feeling of kind of representation, I think I've had a relationship with that concept of representation from the moment I started my training, because from the get-go, I'm represented as the only Muslim on my course, to then being the only Muslim and then becoming the only person of colour on my course, and then in my place, and then it wasn't there in, as I said, in the tutor team, the teaching team, or in the qualified counsellors. So for me, representation comes from being the only to now, kind of 14, 15 years on, it means something else to me. My experience now is, as a Muslim practitioner in the field, I wouldn't say I automatically become the person who represents, but I think I get positioned like that a lot of the time. And obviously that is going to be reinforced by my position of having founded and running the MCAPN, the Muslim Counsellor Network. But I think for me, it becomes a lot more nuanced than that. It's not just a case of I'm here representing Muslim practitioners if I'm in any particular professional space. I think it's also about me having to navigate that position or assumption or projection. Like, I'm having to be really explicit, like I did in my introduction. Am I here representing a Muslim network? Am I here representing a Muslim community? Am I here representing Muslim practitioners, or am I here representing myself? And I think that responsibility alone, the very fact that I'm having to be conscious and explicit and intentional about whether I'm representing myself or representing a community, I think is absolutely kind of reflective of the fact that that's my experience as a Muslim woman, is that any space I go into, I automatically by default become this representation. And I think that, and I think there are advantages and disadvantages to that. I think there are advantages around, yes, being representative and having a voice in the room and in that space. But the disadvantage then is that, where does representation stop and Myra start? Does that make sense? It's a bit like, at what point do I go, actually, I can just speak for myself? And or where am I speaking on behalf of a community, so I can't be individual or share personal experiences? But that's why I'm kind of so conscious today that I'm here as Myra. I'm not here as a representation of my network or of Muslim practitioners generally, or of a Muslim community.
Can I, Myra, it's so evocative what you're saying, but I just really want to understand it a bit more. Like, just going back 15 years to when you're talking about being the only Muslim on the training course, and that what you're describing is something about feeling a pressure to represent, or can you say a little bit more about what that was like and what that means and how that was for you?
I think at that time, I didn't feel the pressure to represent, as in actually proactively represent by speaking up or doing anything. But I think just physically in the room, I was a representation of being Muslim, being from a ethnically minoritized background, being a brown woman. So I think representation 15 years ago was physically being in the room and physically representing a community, a marginalized community. What I felt more then and less now is, I think, because I was then the only one in those spaces, is rather than representation, I was really sat with a sense of, do I belong in those spaces? So representation was there, but more like a secondary background issue. For me, what I felt so much more viscerally and so much more relationally was, oh, do I belong in these spaces? Am I being understood? I always felt kind of I felt a great weight of judgment of, am I going to be good enough? Like, oh, will this woman in a hijab who comes from marginalized background, community, ethnically, racially, and from a faith minoritized community as well, the fact that I had all of these oppressed kind of identities, I felt more pressure to feel like I really had to kind of step up. So for me, it came from a feeling of, I don't know if I belong in this profession. I don't know if there is space for me. I don't know if I'm going to be taken seriously. I don't know if I'm ever going to be seen as good as, next to white colleagues or to non-Muslim colleagues, people that were not, visibly Muslim. So I very much had to question whether this profession was for me and whether I belonged in it or not.
And I think from what I've heard from other people from marginalised groups, that is often the experience. Do I belong? Am I part of this training? What was if it's okay to ask, Myra, what kind of response did you get? What was the context like? Was that supported? Did you feel the trainers and other colleagues understood that? Did you feel that it was ignored?
It was never acknowledged. At no point did a tutor or a counsellor in the team that I was on placement with, no one acknowledged, Myra, what's that like for you to be brown, to be ethnically minoritized, to be the only Muslim? It was never acknowledged. And interestingly, I write about this in my kind of intro to my book, that experience of them being the only, as well as how working with diversity was taught, because I think that has fundamentally shaped and influenced then why I do what I do in the profession. That's why I set up the network. It's why I teach diversity. It's why I teach anti-oppressive practice, because my direct experience of being Muslim in the field was, I then was not being acknowledged. My identity was not being acknowledged. What I could bring to the professional, what I could bring to each client I worked with, the culture, the lived experience, the understanding of my faith, of other faiths, of other cultures, none of it was ever acknowledged. I was almost like in that way treated no differently to every other student in my cohort, but then every student then was taught or treated with that level of kind of neutrality, if that makes sense. Like nothing around faith or race was really acknowledged, but to anybody.
What would have been helpful for you at that time?
I think first and foremost, I think an acknowledgement of each of our identities, and that includes all students, but all the tutors. When I was on placement and I was having in-house supervision in my placement as well, that there being kind of, for me, the first step being that acknowledgement of who we are as individuals in our unique intersectional identities. But when none of that is spoken about, how can we possibly start to get more nuanced and to have a better understanding of how our identity impacts the work or impacts our relationships? So if tutors are saying we don't need to think about it, as a student, I'm probably sat there going, well, I therefore don't need to think about it. So I think there's something about, to me, this takes me to a point of, as trainers, as tutors, as people that run counselling services, especially when we offer student placements, we have a huge responsibility then to bring into the space and to acknowledge and be invitational in the space of people's identities, because we're modelling something. And I guess what it comes down to is it just was never modelled on my training.
And there's something you're describing there that I found quite powerful about also your kind of knowledge and your expertise was lost because it wasn't recognised, that actually you brought all this richness from your culture that for all clients, but particularly groups of clients, could be really important, and that just wasn't that was lost.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's something here about when it doesn't get acknowledged, I think there's something about almost like a very simple equation. It's like not acknowledging or unacknowledged equals unimportant or insignificant. And I think that's kind of at a very basic level, a very general simplified level. I think that's what's happening in the profession, that if we're not acknowledging something, we are saying that it's unimportant, insignificant.
Yeah, and do you feel there needs to be, I guess somebody might argue, but you could have talked about that if you'd wanted to, but there's something about that need for an invitation, isn't there? I guess as a trainee, it's not easy just to put those things out there.
Yeah, I don't, yeah, it's really hard to look back and go, because obviously I'm a different person now. So now, of course, I would absolutely go, right, we need to talk about this. But at the time, there's something about if the tutors in their positions of power are not creating the space for it, students then are going to find it really hard. And I found it then really hard to then create space for it, because we are in that respect, as students, we're at the mercy of the curriculum and the timetable and what the tutors' agendas are, and what they have to do in that session. So it was at the time, it felt like things are not being acknowledged here, that I'm just sat there really just completely befuddled by, going, I just didn't understand. It was just so confusing for me to go, I don't understand why this isn't being spoken about. Yeah.
Sorry to jump in, but it's really making me think about how you're kind of, one of the things that you talk about, Myra, is like, what am I to you, right? Who am I to you? And I was thinking about how you're kind of forced into this position from the outset of being the Muslim woman. And where's Myra? Because Myra's the Muslim woman in the room, but at the same time, your identity as a Muslim woman isn't brought into the space. So you're kind of, you're neither Myra nor the Muslim woman in some ways. You just related to as just a representative rather than as a person with something rich and important, valuable to offer. And how invisible in some ways that you become in that positioning.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something about my identity gets kind of concentrated down to, or minimized down to, yeah, yes, I'm Muslim, I'm in the room, but it absolutely then becomes the elephant in the room as well. It's like it's there, but it's not spoken about. Yeah.
What could the tutor have said? I'm thinking practically, what would be, because I think one of the concerns maybe that tutors have is not wanting to spotlight a student that might feel uncomfortable with being spotlit, not wanting to position someone as the only person of color and having to speak to that, because that can also be a really unfair burden on a student. Just in practical terms for people listening, what would you say? How would you raise that in a way that is non-pressuring?
I think for me, this is about these conversations about inviting people to share their identities and to share their experience of being in the group is part and parcel of where and how training actually needs to evolve and develop. It's why I'm so passionate about teaching diversity and identity in a way that's embedded in the curriculum. A conversation to go, I think I was speaking to a tutor just the other week actually about, I gave it, so this is a very specific practical example here then. I said, when the students come week 1, session 1, and you want to go around the room and do introductions, why don't you invite people to, yes, introduce themselves, but get them to say their name, offer ways of supporting people to pronounce their name properly. And that might be phonetically, write it on the blackboard or whiteboard, but also then share the narrative and story behind their name. Because because for me, that's about then inviting your identity into the room, because we are so connected to our names. Because we might introduce ourselves as a formal name, it might be a nickname, it might be a shortened version, whatever it might be. What we're starting to do is invite our identity into the room, invite our narrative and lived experience in the room. And if that's week 1, can you imagine at the beginning of your training, you're being valued and honoured for who you are straight away? That for me just sets the groundwork to then have conversations about bringing in the rest of your identity. So when we then come to do the modules or the particular term, semester, whatever it might be in your timetables, I'm thinking about identity, different aspects of identity. Students then are already present. So for me, it's not even about jumping into what your identities are in the room. It's that you set that up from week one by inviting people to be their individual selves in the room first. You know, if there had been an invitation to go, Myra, tell us about, A, how do you pronounce your name? Because I know the spelling of my name can confuse people. The I in the middle is silent. But what's the story behind it? How did you get named that way? How did the spelling come about? All of a sudden, then, what I'm sharing is part of my culture, part of my family dynamics, part of my lived experience. And I think that's just a beautiful way to allow people to be in a very containing teaching environment that values the individuals that are in the room rather than as being just representative of visible communities.
It's beautiful, Myra. Thank you. It's really, really helpful way to begin, isn't it? So I'm wondering, Mick, kind of maybe what you're sitting with in response, but maybe what's been different or the same,
Yeah,
as a Jewish your experience.
Yeah, and one of the things when Myra and I first started having this conversation was realizing that there's similarities and there's real differences, and that's where so much of the nuances come in. So I think thinking about my experience as a Jewish person in training, it certainly wasn't ever talked about. There certainly wasn't ever any space in the way that Myra was saying, and if there had been an exercise like that to introduce my name, I could have talked about my grandfather and the kind of Ukrainian and kind of Polish and German Jewish heritage that I have. Probably would have talked about losing family members in the Holocaust, and that kind of culture of the shtetl in Eastern Europe. So it would have been a really good introduction to that. And I think probably in my training, I did talk a bit about it, about being Jewish, you know, in PD groups and things, but it was never really kind of addressed. I think I very much identify as white, and I think there's real differences in what Myra's talking about, in that Myra, you saying about being visibly different. And I think, you know, for me, people might know I'm Jewish, I put it on my Facebook, but people wouldn't necessarily identify me as Jewish, which means that there's a different journey. It's a different journey, you know. There's something about it's not spoken. There's the same kind of not spokenness. There's the same kind of not the opportunity to really immerse and evolve what that means and what it's like to be Jewish in the world, in the community. But there's also a privilege, I think, as a whiteness that I can pass, and I do generally pass as part of the white kind of community that doesn't have to kind of explain itself. And so I didn't have that experience of feeling a kind of I'm the only one here quite in the same way. I think there's something about that Jewishness for me it is about difference, and I do feel different from kind of white my kids talk about the normies, which I don't really like, but there's a sense of being different from the normies in the sense that I don't feel English. I do feel from a different background. I do feel from a different world of how things were done. So I don't feel that I quite fit in, but I can slip into that, and I don't have to face other people seeing me as different, which I think makes a big difference. But I think there is kind of a downside to that. I mean, it's not of a similar magnitude, but I think there's something about being Jewish that means that people can there's an anxiety around anti-Semitism that I've been in professional environments where people have made anti-Semitic comments and they just wouldn't know that I was Jewish, so it just passes because, you know, it's just it passes. And I think as a Jewish person, then one of the things I carry is a constant anxiety about anti-Semitism, and it's like a kind of open wound. There's a caution, and I'm really aware that, like, when I'm around Jewish people, or people who, you know, not religiously Jewish, but people who are culturally Jewish, there's, my blood pressure goes down like 2 or 3 whatever points. There's just something that relaxes, that I don't feel so anxious about having to face just little anti-Semitic comments, just, you know, Jews this and that. I mean, at school I had that. I guess there was a kind of history of kind of not terrible bullying, but certainly anti-Semitic comments at school that were painful, and, you know, Jews killed Jesus, and, you know, Jew was always a word for tight and mean. And, you know, even for instance, if I'm in an environment like a counselling environment and people start talking about money, I start feeling a bit anxious. You know, I can feel just like my blood pressure rising, because I'm just wondering if somebody's going to say, you know, Jewish this, Jewish that. So I think that hiddenness, kind of, there's an alertness, and I think if there had been the space, like you say, to talk about culture, to talk about what it means to be Jewish, to put it out there, in some ways that would have felt better. In some ways, though, I don't know. Like, I think when I did put it out there, and when I did talk about it, it was kind of left unspoken. And there's something about neutrality isn't reassuring. I don't know if that's a bit like what you were saying, Myra, but there's something about the neutrality and the kind of, what I might even use the term of kind of an English whiteness, that I just is quite difficult to read. And I don't know what, one of the things I'm aware of is I don't know what people are kind of thinking me. I don't know what being Jewish means. And I don't think people are, I'm not sure if people would be honest about that. Like, you know, when I say I'm Jewish, what does that evoke? What does the word Jew evoke? You know, we have the kind of implicit bias association test with Black people that show, you know, really powerful associations with blackness, brownness, and negative images. Yeah, I kind of imagine that in the same way that racism is always there, that anti-Semitism is there. It's a, you know, it's a kind of given, I think, but I don't actually know. And I think there's an unknowingness about that is unnerving and uncanny, and taps into a past that is just under the surface of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, of victimization, of persecution, that just goes back generation after generation after generation. So that although on the surface, I guess there's a sense of being white and being part of a privileged white majority, which I feel, and isn't, you know, that is a reality, I think, and is different from, you know, Black and brown people who have to experience something different. There is also traces and nuances of something different. And I think sometimes that doesn't get seen, like the whole debate about Corbyn in the Labour Party and anti-Semitism. I certainly don't think Corbyn was a rabid anti-Semite, but I think there was some non-recognition of some of those sensitivities and something of what gets triggered. And in some of the current debates, I think that is there, and is in no way an excuse for the horrors that are going on. But I think for me, those sensitivities around Jews being, you know, I have in my mind that, you know, if you look at Nazi propaganda and that image of, you know, you've probably seen it, that kind of octopus, or that image of the kind of Jew, the greedy, big-nosed Jew controlling the world, you know, that's very internal. I have that in I carry that, and it's painful, and it means that there's a sensitivity around that. The last time I got really angry with somebody was my daughter was in a show. They were doing Oliver, and I'd said to the person who was doing the show, "Do you really want to do Oliver? There's a really nasty anti-Semitic, you know, character there, like Merchant of the Venice. Do you really want to have Fagin?" And we had this conversation. They were a very kind of woke theatre company. They do lots of stuff with kids and very, you know, do wonderful stuff around disabilities. But I said, "Do you really want to do that?" And they said, "No, we'll tell the kids all about anti-Semitism. We won't, you know, it'll be educational." And when I saw the show, there was just, Fagin comes on as just this terrible Jewish stereotype. It was so unnecessary with the kind of Jewish, you know, one of the hats and kind of talking like this and where's all my money, you know, it was so horrible. I was really upset, really angry. And it felt like to talk about that and to raise that was difficult. It touched on that kind of real sensitivity about what it means to be Jewish. Yeah. And so yeah, so it's a different experience, but also, yeah, and the differences I think are really important, and I think that's part of the dialogue. You know, Nicola, what you were saying about why we're having this dialogue, I think part of it is to understand some of those, and I guess sometimes not understanding those differences is why conflicts and misunderstandings happen.
Recently I watched David Baddiel's program Jews Don't Count. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
One of the things he talks about is that the kind of the stereotypical anti-Semitic perspective is kind of, as you were talking about, this kind of powerful cabal, and that kind of means that in that, as you said, maybe that English whiteness gets to, it's under the radar, or it kind of gets, people can think it's not really racism, or it's not really prejudice. But I guess what I'm hearing you saying is you don't know when that's going to surface. You don't know, because it's there kind of all the time, and you have to be alert to when it might come up or when someone might reveal that. And you don't get that in spaces that are culturally Jewish, and you don't have to be you know, you don't have to be on the lookout for it. You don't have to be protecting yourself in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of know who in the field is Jewish, or I have a sense of it. You can sometimes tell by people's names, or sometimes, yeah, how people are, people's just mannerisms, and there's a safety there, I think. There's just a safety. I remember in my 20s being in a, again, very woke environment. It was to do with the arts, and it was a meeting, we were talking about the arts, and somebody says, it was something like, you know, we want to do new art. We don't want to do art that is just informed by old white dead Jews, something like that. And it was, you know, the comments do come up in a way that is unexpected, and there is that kind of alertness, I think, and that sensitivity to it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I suppose I'm also thinking about the thing about whiteness, and you identifying as white and passing as white, and other Jews maybe not identifying as white, or not being identified. Certainly if we were in another kind of Holocaust, I guess you wouldn't be identified as white, right? You'd be identified as whatever the fascist government decided to identify you as.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think that's how a lot of kind of Jews identify their Jewishness, by what the Nazis have decided, you know. And even though I'm not religious, and you're right, Nicola, that, you know, Hasidic Jews with the hats, you know, they're much more identifiable. And it's interesting also, I mean, they're involved in counselling, and there's some interesting work being done there. But yeah, that is very different. But at the end of the day, as a lot of Jews will say, you know, if you're going to be, you know, sent off to Auschwitz because you're identified as Jewish because you've got Jewish grandparent, then that alertness is going to be there, that's how you're going to be categorized.
And that's a generational part of the identity of being a Jewish person, that persecution has followed across countries and continents and decades and hundreds of years. And
yeah, it was, I went to Auschwitz when I went there in my 20s, and I thought there's a kind of there's a record base there, and I went there to see, just by chance, if they had records of any of my family, and they did. And it was such a shock to see these German documents saying so and so, Hans Kohln and different people were transported. Several members of my mum's family died in the Holocaust, in the most horrific circumstances, and my dad's family escaped Ukraine persecution. And actually, my daughter made a film about my great grandfather, who was taken into the Russian army force, conscripted, kidnapped. So yeah, so there is that, and it kind of follows you. But also, what follows you, Nicola, is not just that history, but also that sense that as a Jew, you deserve that. You know, that's the internalized bit. As a Jew, you deserve that. There's something that you've done wrong. That means that as a Jew, that happened, you know, whether that's a kind of just world hypothesis, whether that's internalizing just that racism, whether it's a way of kind of unconsciously trying to make sense of it. But I think that's the really difficult bit, and that's the sensitivity. You know, if all that stuff had happened and there was just, because of course there is, you know, that's unjust, you know, that's terrible. That would be one thing, but I think it's the shame that comes with that, the sense of guilt, you know, as we know from people who've been traumatized and abused, that people make sense of it in different ways. And I think it's carrying that shame around that that persecution and the questions that is maybe why there is so much, part of why there's so much sensitivity.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Myra, if you want to respond as well.
Yeah, just fascinated by kind of Mick, what you're sharing. I'm kind of, I think what's really struck me is something about kind of two layers. I think is what I'm really sat with, this idea of, on the surface, we, in terms of identity, there's something about my faith is very visible, and your faith being Jewish, Mick, is about it sits under the surface, it's not visible, and being white passing. So there's something about, there's a difference there when it comes to our visible identity, and not just from an obvious difference in terms of different faiths, but I'm just talking about in terms of visibility of our faiths. And yet, when you then speak about what sits under the surface, I'm sat there going, but then we're the same or similar. So I think I'm really struck by this thing about what might be seen visibly, how people perceive us, will absolutely, for each of us, bring along various kind of projections and assumptions and expectations around us, and what people might assume we're like, or think we're like, or pigeonhole us, whatever they do through our visible identity. But there's something that I can really resonate with, that underneath the surface, though, I think we're both sat with history, legacy, and also in current events and times individually, we're sat with then that experience of being oppressed and minoritized and marginalized, and in any given moment being on the receiving end of an Islamophobic or anti-Semitic comment, to hear that bias or prejudice, to be witness to something that is deeply oppressive and offensive to a big part of who we are in each of our respective identities. So I think there's something here really interesting for me, which is about, for people just to look at the two of us, like visibly, to put us next to each other, Mick, as we are on screen right now. There's something about, we would be labelled completely differently. And yet, I think underneath the surface, we both sit with, I think, such shared experiences. And that, like you talk about that anxiety of, or if you're outside of a Jewish majority space, if you're not around other culturally Jewish people, like you have that increased anxiety. And I'm thinking, well, I can really resonate with that for myself, that if I'm in, you know, a dominant or majority Muslim space, or in an all Muslim space, that I'm not going to be homogenized as them being representative, first of all. And I'm not then going to be seen as, I'm more likely then to be seen, or I am seen then as the individual that I am. But there's something then about the moment we are both then in spaces that are if I could put it like this, like non-Jewish dominant and non-Muslim dominant, if we're in kind of mainstream spaces, mainstream white spaces, then something happens to both of us internally that goes, oh, we become all of a sudden more sensitive to, more aware of, I'm more hyper alert to the potential for something to be said, or for somebody to act towards us in a way that then is incredibly oppressive and dominant, and you know, coming from a very kind of supremacist position. So,
and I think one of the
sorry,
Myra, I think one of the things about that is that it puts you in a position where you have to think, do I want to respond or not? So it's like, then you have to decide, am I going to challenge this? Am I going to let it go, but then feel really uncomfortable? How is this going to affect, you know, how I see this person? like, I want to get on with this person, but I'm getting, so it kind of makes things difficult afterwards, and there's a kind of legacy of it. It's not just a thing. But I was really interested in what you said, Myra, over there about, so when you're in a kind of Muslim space, do you feel that you can be more, do you feel that you can be more yourself? Do you feel, is there also that sense of kind of relaxing a bit?
I think there is a relaxation in the sense of people are far more going to see me as Myra rather than Muslim counsellor.
That's so interesting. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So can you say more about that? So you feel that people will see you more as who you are?
Yeah, I think there's something around my individuality, my individual identity, lived experiences, my own opinions, maybe my own kind of whatever it might be about my passions, my hobbies, my interests, all of that. It feels like there's just more space for me to kind of share more of who I am, because there's space for it, because I'm not just being pigeonholed as Muslim. And I think also in Muslim majority or all Muslim spaces, I think there is also, but actually no, as I'm thinking that through, I think it depends which Muslim space I'm in, to be honest. But I do think there is a greater capacity though to, yes, to be seen as an individual, and also for your experience as a Muslim to be individual as well. But I do think, though, it depends on what space you're in, though, because equally, I'm mindful that in some Muslim spaces, there is something then that, on the flip side, there is, I think, a pressure to conform. There is a pressure then to be like everyone else. So it has its advantages and disadvantages. But from a place, though, of individuality, though, I do feel that I definitely don't feel that immediate burden of I'm now representing all Muslims in this space. If I'm in a Muslim dominant or majority space, because actually we're all representative, and therefore we're able to be, we come with an individual identity into those spaces first. Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. Do you feel that in a kind of non-Muslim space that you have to hide certain aspects of yourself? Do you feel that you have to kind of control things that maybe you wouldn't otherwise?
An interesting question. I think it's situation specific. I don't necessarily think I hold a certain list or, you know, a box of things that I generally go, right, none of this stuff can be spoken about in non-Muslim spaces. I don't think it's that. I think it's more about being aware. I think it's more about, there's a relational process going on in which I feel like, how am I being related to in this space? And if I'm being related to as if I'm Muslim representative or the Muslim, then I think I'm much more mindful, I think, of perhaps what I do say or share versus being related to as Myra. And I think when I'm related to as Myra, I can bring more of myself. So it's not necessarily that there are certain things I don't speak about. It's just about what is there capacity in this relationship where I can bring more of myself into it or not. Whereas if I feel like I'm being brought into a space or related to as being a Muslim representative or representing Muslims, I feel like, oh, there are just barriers immediately up or certain hurdles that I'm like, I've got to get this person to kind of remove those or jump over those before they can actually see me. For the very fact that they've not seen me means that I can't bring all of me into it, because they haven't created the capacity for it or the space for me in that relationship. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Oh yeah, no, totally. Totally. But how do you is there something that gives you a sense that somebody's not seeing you, that they're seeing you as that representative? How do you sense that?
I was thinking that as I was saying it out loud, actually, so it's a good question. So I was thinking, I'm not actually sure. It's a feeling, it's a vibe, I think it's about, and I suppose something is specifically about professional spaces. I think for me, it's about, as a Muslim, as a Muslim therapist, just in that identity alone, it's about, I'm always curious about, and I'm curious, but I think I always question, why am I being invited into this space? Because is it a quick win that the people that hold power in that space have got great tick box, we've got a Muslim being, representing? And I think it's hard to pinpoint and be specific, But I think for me, I pick it up relationally when I know that they've invited me because they actually know about me and my individual work, versus they speak to me as if they know nothing about me individually, and they're speaking to me. Yeah, actually, it's that. It comes down to, are they speaking to me as if they know me or not? I know that sounds really vague, but I can just sense it. I know when I've been invited into spaces feeling like, oh, I'm the only Muslim in this space, and I think I've been invited because I represent a particular marginalised community, versus, Myra, we really want you to be in this space.
I don't know if this is helpful, but I have been learning about code switching recently.
Yeah.
So code switching, this idea, I think it came in the Black community or person of color community initially, is this idea that the language that you use shifts depending on the context that you're in. And I've seen a lot of LGBTQ spaces talking about it, and neurodivergent spaces, which I can identify with code switching, a way of being myself more authentically in spaces where I know that those codes are gonna be shared. And your whole kind of presentation and way of being, it's very unconscious, recognizing when you're in a space where you can be your natural codes or speak to your natural codes, and where you can't. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it is. I think there is definitely an element of, and I think I was, how can I put it? I think I was doing it more unconsciously, like going back to like 14 years ago when I did my training. I look back and go, oh, I think I did a lot of code switching to feel like I had to fit in and to feel like I did belong. Now, I think I'm much more conscious of when I do that, and I do it less, if that makes sense. Yeah. But yeah, and exactly that, Nicola, you know, as somebody also who is neurodivergent as well. So for me, there's something about, I think that's the other thing. I'm also really mindful being invited into spaces because they want a Muslim perspective or they want a ethnic minoritized perspective. But it's really interesting because I kind of show up in these spaces and go, but I also represent other identities as well. And I'm going to be explicit and name those as well. And I'm going to be speaking at the on neurodivergence, on neurodiversity, working within neurodiversity at an upcoming conference. And it's the same thing where I'm going to introduce by actually naming those parts of my identity. Because again, it's so easy to feel like I wear hijab, therefore I'm representative of Muslims, but somehow that excludes me from representing any other community that I'm actually a member of. Yeah. And I think I think I'm doing a lot more work for me and for the profession by actually being much more open, authentic, and explicit about that. I think that's so important in our profession, that we hold space for each of our identities and not just for the ones that we have come to represent or have become known for, if that makes sense.
There's something very powerful for me there about also kind of like what's visible and what's not visible. Like your hijab is visible, your neurodiversity isn't. I guess I was talking about my Jewishness is less visible, and there's something about having space for both the visible and, really importantly, the non. I mean, I guess as therapists we should know that, shouldn't we? There's something about the non-visible identities, but there is something very powerful about visible identities, and I guess it's a kind of cognitive bias, for want of a better word, that we can be overly influenced by them and read a lot based. I did my thesis actually when my PhD was on masks, and I was really interested in masks and the way that I did a study as part of my PhD where we put on ask people to hold the same body pose, but in one case wear a happy mask and in one case wear a sad mask, and then other people had to rate what they were, what that person was feeling, even though they knew absolutely that it was a mask. And we said, this is a mask. We told them it was a mask. When they looked at the person wearing a happy mask, they thought they were happier than the person wearing a sad mask. I mean, it's a clear kind of cognitive kind of bias and a mistake. But I did want to, I mean, for you, it was okay to us, and don't answer this, Myra, if you don't want to, but I did want to understand a bit more about the hijab and what it means for you and what's that experience.
Yeah. Interestingly, I chose and I started wearing the hijab, what might be deemed kind of quite late, if that makes sense, because I know that for culturally, I think for girls to wear hijab, it's, you know, from that puberty age, you know, so kind of the equivalent then of kind of in secondary school, you'll see girls wear, and you see it a lot more now as well. Culturally, for me, because of my childhood, because of the cultural background that I've grown up in, nobody in no women in my family wore hijab in the way that I do. I mean, culturally, coming from of a South Asian heritage, like they'll wear the scarves loosely over their head, but that's cultural rather than wearing hijab in the way that I wear it. And so for me, coming to it was absolutely kind of this individual journey. And interestingly, I started wearing the hijab at the point where so we're going back again 15 years ago, interestingly, so the timelines correspond. I started wearing the hijab like full time, like that, very properly, because I tend to wear it during Ramadan, during the month of fasting, for the few years prior. But I decided to start wearing it kind of properly and all the time when I started my training, interestingly. So I'd done my 2-year certificate in psychodynamic counselling, and then just as I was due to start my 2-year diploma, it was in that summer, because I did the certificate straight, you know, I did the diploma straight off the back of the certificate, and I had like a summer break, and it was during that summer. So I started my training at the point where I started wearing hijab. So my journey of being a counsellor is so kind of parallel to my experience of being visibly Muslim. And I think a lot of that has to then do with the counsellor I've become, because that journey to choose to wear it and to be visibly Muslim, I think has really played a part then in, like what you were just saying, Mick, about how we present visibly holds such great weight to how we perceive people, that I was learning that at the time where I was training to be a counsellor, and to sit with my clients and go, okay, you visibly look like this, but what's the hidden parts? What's beneath or behind your visible identity? And I think I was I feel like that helped me to be more attuned to my clients, because I found that was happening to me as well, that people were seeing the scarf first. It was obviously my first experience of that, and then going, oh yeah, but there's Myra behind it, like I'm not just the scarf. So yeah, so for me, like I said, it was like 15 odd years ago that I started wearing it, and very much an individual journey. And that's another thing, again, I think the projections, the stereotypes that come with wearing the hijab, it's like, again, it's all those connotations of, well, you're oppressed, you're told you have to wear it. It's like your dad's told you must. And I'm like, mine was the complete opposite experience. So for me, it's a very individual relationship with it. I think for me, it is a way of, for me, it is a symbol, a signifier of grounding me in my faith. I think it's something, yeah, so something kind of very, it's both physical as well as very metaphorical of, yeah, grounding me in my faith. And it's interesting that I chose to do that then just as I started to train as a counsellor, because I do absolutely think that the two are connected. Yeah.
It sounds like it was an expression of an internal process, and very much aligned with recognizing that faith and wanting to be outside physically in alignment with what you felt very powerfully deep inside. It was part of your growth and very much part of that journey to wear the hijab.
Yeah, and it was something that I felt I wanted to have, almost something about, by having it absolutely, it was there internally, and I was holding it internally, but to then wear it, to wear hijab and to have it externally, also, I think you go through a real process of, how can I put it? It really challenges your ego, incredibly challenges your ego. And for me, it was a process of finding value. Interesting, we're talking about identity and hidden and hidden and visible. There is a real irony, I think, that in wearing hijab, you actually, for me, it was about not tying up my ego or my sense of value in what I looked like externally, and actually helped me to find value internally. So rather than value, because I should really put that in context, because for me, previously, before I wore hijab, it's like I had at the time really long hair, and it would be commented on all the time. And And so for me, there was something about a real value in my hair, and, you know, that the anxieties and the attachment I had to having good hair days. Do you know what I mean? Like the anxiety of going, what makes me feel good about myself and what makes me feel worthwhile or valuable or attractive as a person. It was all tied up in my hair. And so to wear the hijab for me was a moment of going, Myra, you're not your hair, but also your value is about what's in your heart and in your soul and not tied up in what's something external.
Can I ask something then, Myra? Because I think this is surfacing something for me that is around faith and around experiencing my difference as a woman here, somebody whose hair is kind of visible.
Yeah.
And perhaps one of my fears as a woman is that I might be breaking one of your rules, or that I might be doing something that you would judge as, you know, I mean, I'm not feeling that about you because I know you, Myra, but thinking about how a woman who doesn't wear a hijab might be afraid of what's the judgment coming. I think this speaks to kind of faith difference and not necessarily knowing what in Islam you might feel about women who don't wear hijabs and things. I just think it might be helpful to explore that.
Yeah, I think for me, and maybe because I've had a adult experience of not wearing hijab, so maybe I came to it at a level of maturity and understanding at the time 15 years ago. But also with that, I think in offering myself compassion for that, how can I say that? In choosing to wear it, I was then able to offer compassion to the Myra that didn't wear it before. Yeah. For you know, however many years before I didn't wear it. And so because of that, then I sit with that respect and value for any woman, Muslim, non-Muslim, who wears hijab or who doesn't wear hijab, because for me it's such an individual journey. And I think I do that thing of, I probably was, I don't know whether I was consciously or explicitly judged for not wearing it at the time, and I don't ever remember being judged, because as I said earlier, I grew up in a family that women didn't wear proper, I say proper, but traditional hijab. So I grew up in a family that we weren't judged or shamed for not wearing hijab. And so for me, part of my faith is to actually offer that compassion to every other woman. Yeah. And to go, and particularly for Muslim women, if you wear hijab, if you don't wear hijab, that's your individual journey and that's your business. I'm not here to sit and judge that, because I've been on both sides.
I think this discussion is touching on for me is the kind of the way that religious faiths have been pitted against each other culturally and kind of globally. And I'm also still holding what you said earlier, Mick, about the shame that's projected onto Jewish people that is part of the identity of being Jewish. That's a faith narrative, right? That's very much about Christian interpretations of Jewish practices, Jewish belief. And I'm just about kind of perhaps you two as individuals, what is meaningful to you about human relationship? Maybe I don't know if there's something about. I'm thinking from perspective of somebody who's raised as a Christian, who sees the world. Christians see the world as those who are in the right faith, those who are in the wrong faith, those who are true believers, those who aren't true believers. This separatism that's projected out, but actually the three of us as individuals will have probably different metaphysical beliefs about what we're doing on the planet and what a relationship is at a fundamental level. Just wondering if you could both speak to.
I think, I'm not sure this relates exactly to what you're saying, Nicola, but what came up for me when you were asking Myra that question and about feeling judged was just about, you know, we talked about the kind of experience of marginalization and minoritization. I think what we haven't talked about so much yet is what gets projected onto people of different faith that is threatening or judgmental or critical. And I think is, you know, if I think about as a Jew, my relationship to Christianity, that Jews are seen as harmful, as dangerous, you know, historically as destroying, as, you know, eating Christian children and kind of circumcising them and things like that. And I think that there is those projections. It's really interesting that in your hijab, you know, you're talking about it as a kind of symbol of personal growth and as an expression of something deeply spiritual within you. And yet people can read that as something aggressive or critical. And I think as being Jewish, people can see that Judaism as being something that they have to defend against or something threatening. And it's so alien to my experience. You know, sometimes when I hear these conspiracy theories about Jews, I think, like, just what, you know, like, I just can't imagine. It's like, it's not the Jews that I know who are like controlling the world and the banks and doing everything. And yet there is this projection of enormous threat onto others. And I guess that's something about talking about our personal experiences and relating in that way is important, because I think when people listen, Myra, when I listen to you talking about hijab and what it means for you, it's so different from the stereotypes I hold. It's so different from a kind of fear that it's threatening. That, you know, what I understand, I read a book about the Prophet Muhammad, and I just found it, you know, really moving to actually understand it and to have some sense of it. I mean, not understand it, have some sense of it. The projections onto Islam, I mean, are just horrendous in terms of how it's seen as. And I think for a lot of people, that's the immediate association is Islam threat, terrorists, you know, something destructive. Jews may be powerful, and I think it's partly because we don't talk about the experiences, or what we do is we go from our own experience of insecurity. You know, something I've learned being in the therapy world for all these years, and you're just a youngster, Myra, compared with me, you know, 15 years. I think God knows how many decades I've been here. It's just how vulnerable everybody is, just how vulnerable and scared most of us are. And you know, so few of us are thinking about, you know, I want to do this to hurt so and so. I just, you know, I'm sure you know with your clients, but that's not where clients are at. They're not thinking, oh, how can I destroy people? How can I hurt people? So much of the dialogue is feeling threatened, feeling scared. And as a Jew, I feel scared. I think as a Muslim, you know, you feel scared. I'm sure Christians feel scared as well. And it's the talking and sharing, I think, seeing those inner worlds that maybe can diffuse some of that fear and help us realize that the other isn't out to get us. Sometimes they can be scary, but often it's because of something that is unknown. That's not a threat. That's not a threat just because it's different. Sorry, Nicola, that didn't answer your question at all.
No, I feel like I want to say that I don't identify as Christian, but partly because of that. I mean, I don't share that faith, but that the projection, fearful projection onto other groups is part of religious dogmatism that I can't kind of sit with. And I think that is partly, I might project onto somebody in interfaith. I might assume that a dogmatism comes with that when it doesn't, but it's part of being raised in this society, maybe.
Yeah. And I'm wondering then if that, I'm immediately like kind of linking it back then to, you know, as me and Mick have spoken about kind of our experiences then being in, for Mick being in kind of non-Jewish spaces, for me being in non-Muslim spaces, is that, I think that's the anxiety we're speaking about, that feeling of unknown, unfamiliar, unsafe, of what is going to come at us because of the stereotypes that people will hold about our faith. And I think that then immediately relates then to why I'm so mindful of how I then show up in spaces, because maybe I'm then consciously and unconsciously then doing my hardest, doing all the kind of emotional and mental gymnastics then not to be the threat, not to be the terrorist, not to be the person that's going to be angry and destructive and somebody that's going to be oppositional. And I think I'm just so mindful that there's something about needing to show up in a way that feels open and welcoming and friendly, and I'm like your friendly neighborhood Muslim therapist kind of thing. And it does, I think at times it does feel like that, but me as a Muslim woman in a hijab coming into a space, yes, might or will feel threatening to some people. And so I then have to be non-threatening. I think it's reflected in, and then I think that I hold, because again, we don't just hold marginalized identities, I absolutely then equally hold alongside it some privileged identities. And I think my education, my professional status, my accent then go a long way in reducing the threat. So I recognize that I have also resources and tools to hand that also enable me to kind of dispel some of those threats or projections that somebody might have on their immediate perception of me. But I do know that that immediate perception of me is there whenever I walk into a room.
I think that's so interesting, Myra, and I really share that sense of having kind of going into space in a way, diffusing, not being the greedy Jew, not being the selfish one, not being this kind of powerful Jewish caricature, but diffusing that and kind of being, yeah, your nice friendly Muslim and your nice friendly Jew who aren't going to do any harm. And it is extra work, isn't it? As you say, it kind of takes extra work that you have to do that. And probably I imagine you have to do it more than me, in a sense that because of the visibility that is going to come at you. I've kind of got a choice about whether I disclose, whether I talk about being Jewish, and so there's a different process, and there's both a process of, do I introduce it and then do I diffuse it, or do I just leave it and kind of pass as a Christian, but in that lose something of myself in that process. And I think part of me, when you're talking about wearing a hijab, part of me is really impressed and proud, if that's the right word, and thinking, wow, that's because there's something about you putting yourself out there and saying, right, I know people are going to make stereotypes and have assumptions, but actually it's really important to me, and I'm going to put myself out there. And it does make me think, I could wear a Star of David, I could have changed my name to a more, back to my family name, to make it much more evident that I was Jewish. And I kind of chose, I guess, in a way, not to do that, and to kind of have those options, which I kind of feel bad. I mean, it's almost part of that. It's just maybe it would have been braver to just really say it, or maybe I shouldn't have to feel that I have to face that in the first place.
I think what I'm really left with, kind of as we're coming to the end of this conversation, is one of the things you talk about, Myra, is kind of being a safer person, that there's no safe space, but be a safer person in the space. It's something I talk about a lot with students, and how we can be safer people. It's just about, isn't it, for me as somebody with that white privilege of being able to sense when I'm relating to somebody with those projections, in a way that creates that anxiety for me, doing some of the work so that you're not having to do the work, so that I'm doing the work, so that in the space you don't need to be sensitive to my anxiety, that I can actually sit with my anxiety and realize that there's no threat here.
I think that's so well put, Nicola. I think that's so well put. And I think in that it is something about, people from privileged groups doing that work of thinking about the stereotypes, thinking about the assumptions, kind of diffusing it in a way that then allows people from marginalized groups not to have to do all that work all the time, because they can go into that space. But I think there's something proactive about that. It's like, it can't, I mean, it is a psychological internal process for people in those privileged groups, but also I think something needs to be communicated. I think that's what we're also talking about, is like, and again, it comes back to this theme about visibility and invisibility, but kind of as a Jewish person, I kind of assume anti-Semitism unless that's diffused. Myra's been talking about kind of assuming people make assumptions. There's something about, and we're talking about trainers, that's where he talks about trainers. And I think that's such a key thing that you're emphasizing there. Like, trainers need to hold this, they need to address this. The idea that kind of being neutral is going to somehow resolve it just by being non-directive and not going anywhere. It needs guiding, and it needs explicitness in bringing up these issues and addressing these issues and holding these issues and supporting people to feel that they can really bring themselves forwards in the way that we've been talking about.
Myra, perhaps if I give the last word to you about that as well, about what that would look like for you.
I think what I'm left with is just a real sense that this is really nuanced, and actually for me it just emphasizes why we need to have the spaces in our trainings and in our counselling services to have these dialogues and discussions about who we are. Because I'm just thinking about between me and Mick today, I think I've just got a sense of, gosh, how much have we been individually carrying? And actually there are like-minded or similar people who are carrying those similar burdens and responsibilities and doing those same kind of emotional and mental gymnastics. And yet we're actually in the same kind of group trying to do that, we're in the same position. So I think the more we're able to have open dialogues about it, and especially on trainings, I think that allows us to understand then how much we are each individually carrying in order just to navigate the world. Like there's so much going on internally, and I think we need to allow space and capacity for us to explore that further.
Thank you very much, both of you. That was really wonderful. I loved kind of sitting here and being here with you, and I hope the listeners enjoyed that too and have their own kind of response, that they're co-creating some meaning from that that's important, meaningful to them. Thank you for your time and for doing.
Thank you so much, Nicola, for holding the space, and for Myra for being so open and talking about things.
Yeah, thank you as well, Mick. I feel like there's something about having discovered such commonalities between our experiences, and I just think that's a beautiful thing. So thank you, Mick, and thank you, Nicola, for facilitating and holding such a safe space.
Thanks, Myra. Thank you.